Spain's interior ministry counted 50,000 people. Ceuta's own president said 60,000. Nobody can give you a firm number for the night of July 30th. We do know the size of the city they walked into. About 84,000 people live there. And that missing number is the least strange thing about this story. Because 3 months before that night, a committee of the United States Congress wrote one sentence about Ceuta. It called the city Spanish administered. In the same line, it placed the city in Moroccan territory. Both halves. One sentence. In a document that funds American foreign policy. The House of Representatives passed it on the 15th of July. 15 days later, the border broke. On July 15th, the House passed a bill numbered the bill, number 8595, by 217 votes to 209. It is an appropriations bill. It funds American foreign policy for the coming year. It is a serious piece of legislation. $3.3 billion for Israel, $500 million in military assistance for Taiwan. Read the bill itself and you will find nothing about Spain, nothing about Morocco, nothing about Ceuta. The language sits in the report attached to the bill, pages 86 and 87. That report describes Ceuta and Melilla, two cities administered by Spain, as located in Moroccan territory. It notes that Morocco has claimed them for a long time, and it backs the Secretary of State in encouraging talks between Rabat and Madrid about their future status. The same document sends Morocco $20 million in national security investment and $20 million more in foreign military financing, $40 million of American money to the country on the other side of that fence. The subcommittee that wrote this is chaired by Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida. He is also vice chair of the Full Appropriations Committee. And 4 months before writing about Ceuta, Diaz-Balart issued a statement praising the president for launching major combat operations against Iran. Hold that thought. Spain had just refused to take part in that same campaign. So this video has one question to answer. Why is the United States Congress writing about the future status of a Spanish city at all? Start with what actually happened, because the details matter more than the numbers. The crossing point is called Tarajal. It sits where the fence meets the sea, on the western edge of the city. On the night of the 30th of July, people began moving around the breakwater there, not through the fence. Around it, along the water, witnesses described thousands of young men walking past that breakwater. Some had wives with them, some had children. The overwhelming majority were young Moroccan men from towns close to the border. Alongside them were Algerians who had been living in Morocco, a smaller number of people from further south, some women, and a large number of children traveling without any adult. Many carried their phones in plastic bags to keep them dry. And over the sound of the surf, people on the Spanish side could hear the crowd shouting Viva España. Some tried to swim around the barrier. Not all of them reached the other side. The death toll moved all week. Early reports said 18, then 34, then 41, then 43, then 57. By the 1st of August, major outlets were reporting at least 67. I am not going to pick one of those numbers for you. That the count kept moving for 4 days is itself part of this story. Nobody had a complete picture of what was happening while it was happening. Spain deployed the army. Engineers installed a floating barrier roughly 500 meters long across the water at Tarajal. Within days, Spanish authorities had returned tens of thousands of people to Morocco. The figure moved from around 37,000 to over 48,000 in a single afternoon. Those returns went faster than any asylum process can legally run. That gap between what the law requires and what a border does under pressure is what Spanish courts had been arguing about for years. We will come back to it. And then it started in Melilla, 300 kilometers east along the same coast. That is the event. Now, the Ceuta sits on the North African coast, about 14 kilometers across the water from mainland Spain. Both it and Melilla are Spanish cities. Both are surrounded by Morocco on every landside. Spain has held Ceuta since the 15th century. Morocco has claimed it since independence in 1956. That claim has never been withdrawn. Spain has never negotiated over it. Here is why this reaches beyond Spain. These are the only two places where the European Union meets Africa by land. Everywhere else on that border, there is sea. Here, there is a fence and a customs post. And that customs post matters more than it sounds. Ceuta has almost no industry. It runs on port traffic, public sector jobs, and trade with the region around it. Thousands of Moroccan workers used to cross into the city every morning. Thousands of jobs inside Ceuta depended on goods moving the other way. Morocco shut the commercial customs post at Melilla in 2018. And the arrangement at Ceuta has not been normal since. So before any of this began, both cities already depended on a neighbor who could switch their economy off. Now the part almost nobody outside Spain knows. In 2022, NATO held its summit in Madrid. Spain used its own summit to ask the alliance for something specific. Spain wanted Ceuta and Melilla explicitly covered by Article 5, the clause that treats an attack on one member as an attack on all. The allies did not agree. The initiative went nowhere, so Spain knew the gap was there. Spain asked its allies to close it. They declined. That was 4 years before the night at Tarajal. Spain's government has an explanation, and it is not a strange one. Earlier, I said we would come back to how fast those returns happened. This is where Spain has a practice its own lawyers call immediate returns. A person who climbs the fence is walked back through a gate, sometimes within minutes, with no paperwork at all. Spanish and European courts have been fighting over that practice for a decade. The objection is simple. You cannot know whether someone qualifies for protection if you never ask. On the 29th of June, Spain's Supreme Court settled one narrow question. Spanish law allows a summary return only when someone crosses what it calls a border containment element, a fence, a barrier, a physical thing. A person who swims around the end of the breakwater never crosses one, so they cannot be walked straight back. Their case has to be opened, on paper, one file at a time. On the 8th of July, a second ruling strengthened the obligation to care for unaccompanied children found on Spanish soil. Neither ruling opened any border. Both were narrow. But through July, posts circulated in Morocco saying the border was effectively open, with practical advice on how to make the swim. The rulings were described as something they were not. And the numbers had already moved before any of that. In the first half of 2026, land arrivals into Ceuta reached 2,582. In the same months of 2025, the figure was 978, an increase of 164%. Across the rest of Spain over the same period, irregular arrivals fell, from about 18,000 to about 12,000. So Ceuta was not riding a national wave. Ceuta was going the opposite way to the rest of the country. There is one more Spanish decision in this picture, and it is the largest. In January, Sanchez announced a mass regularization for migrants already living in Spain without papers. More than 1.1 million people applied, roughly double what the government had projected. By the 2nd of July, around 610,000 had been approved. Put all of that together and Madrid's explanation gets stronger, not weaker. A narrowed return power. 2 rulings misrepresented online. A regularization program visible from the other side of the fence. Arrivals already climbing while the rest of the countries fell. That is a real pull built almost entirely out of Spanish decisions. And it still does not explain one night. Between the 20th and the 29th of July, about 1,500 people reached Ceuta. 200 a day, already a record pace. Then came the 30th, and the figure was somewhere between 50 and 60,000. That is not a trend accelerating. That is a different event. So the card stays on the board. It explains the summer. It does not explain the night. There is a second explanation, and Spain has already lived through it once. In April 2021, Spain quietly admitted a seriously ill man to a hospital in Logroño under a name that was not his. He was Brahim Ghali, leader of the Polisario Front, the movement that has fought Morocco for control of Western Sahara since the 1970s. Rabat found out. The diplomatic reaction was immediate. The following month, Moroccan border control at Ceuta eased. Around 8,000 people crossed in 2 days. More than 1,000 of them were children traveling without an adult. The European Parliament passed a resolution condemning the use of minors as political leverage. Spain's own defense minister went on public radio and said it plainly. Call it what you like, she said. She called it blackmail. She accused Rabat of using children and of endangering lives for a purpose she said she did not understand. So this mechanism is not a theory. It has a rehearsal, and the rehearsal worked. Within months, Spain began moving. To see why, you need one piece of history. In 1975, Morocco organized what it called the Green March. Around 350,000 unarmed civilians walked into Spanish Sahara to claim it. Spain withdrew. Morocco has controlled most of that territory ever since, and the Polisario Front has never accepted it. For 47 years, Spain stayed formally neutral on who owns it. In 2022, Sanchez ended that. He wrote to King Mohammed VI endorsing Morocco's autonomy plan. It was a reversal of half a century of Spanish policy. And it bought Madrid several quiet years. Recently, Madrid has drifted back toward the Sahrawi side, and the quiet has worn thin. And days before the 30th of July, Pedro Sanchez flew to Algeria. Algeria hosts the Polisario Front. Algeria is Morocco's main rival in the region. From Rabat, that trip did not look neutral. One caution here, and it cuts against Madrid, not for it. A government facing the worst border failure in its modern history has every reason to point outward. Blaming a neighbor is easier than explaining your own border policy. Keep that in mind for everything Spain says from here on. But something still does not fit. Morocco had this motive in 2023, and in 2024, and in 2025. The Algeria trip was not the first Spanish move Rabat disliked. The lever was sitting there the whole time. It was not pulled. Why this summer? To answer that, we leave the border and go to the Persian Gulf. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel opened an air campaign against Iran. Spain hosts 2 American bases. Ceuta is a naval station on the Atlantic coast. Morocco is an air base inland. Ceuta sits at the mouth of the Strait of Gibraltar. For American operations reaching into the Mediterranean and past it, that position is close to irreplaceable. The arrangement dates back to 1953, and it has been renegotiated several times since. Under the current agreement, offensive operations launched from Spanish soil require Spanish consent. On the 2nd of March, Spain withheld it. Defense Minister Margarita Robles said the bases would give no military support to the campaign. Humanitarian use only. 15 American aircraft left the country. 9 tankers flew from Morocco to Germany. 2 more went from Ceuta to southern France. Tankers are the unglamorous center of any long-range air campaign. Without them, strike aircraft do not reach their targets and come home. Moving them from Spain to Germany does not stop a war. It adds distance, fuel, and time to every single mission for as long as that war lasts. On the 30th of March, Spain went further and closed its airspace to American aircraft involved in the operation. The White House said Spain had shifted and agreed to cooperate. Spain's foreign ministry publicly contradicted that. No change of position, no agreement. Now, a correction to a version of this story you may have heard. Spain was not the only country to refuse. Britain refused at first too. Several NATO members balked at operations around the Strait of Hormuz. The difference is that Britain reversed. Keir Starmer authorized the use of British facilities for what was described as collective self-defense. Spain did not reverse. That is what made Madrid the outlier, not the refusal, holding it. So Washington has a problem. An ally has said no in public and stayed there. The question is what you can actually do. Iran is the loudest part of this quarrel. It is not the oldest. In May 2024, Spain formally recognized the state of Palestine. Norway and Ireland did the same on the same day. Madrid had spent months pushing other European capitals toward that position, and it pushed loudly. Other countries followed later, but Spain was among the first, and it was the noisiest of them. There was also a quieter episode, and it went further than most people realize. In May 2024, Spain refused a Danish flagged ship carrying explosives to Israel permission to dock at Cartagena. The foreign minister said it would be consistent policy from then on. That November, 2 more ships were turned away at Algeciras. Both had sailed from New York. Both belonged to a program of commercial vessels that the American Defense Department can call on in wartime. Washington did not treat that as symbolism. The United States Federal Maritime Commission opened a formal investigation into Spain, with penalties available in the millions per voyage and the option of barring Spanish vessels from American ports. An ally had blocked American military cargo, and an American regulator opened a file on it. Then came the American plan for Gaza. Madrid declined to endorse it, insisting the United Nations and the Palestinians had to be part of any settlement. Sanchez called the campaign in the region unlawful. He said it from podiums, not in private cables. So by the spring of 2026, Madrid had a record. Recognition of Palestine, refusal on Gaza, refusal on Iran, refusal on 5%. 4 refusals, all public, all from the same government, inside 2 years. Now put the neighbor beside it. Morocco normalized relations with Israel in 2020, under agreements Washington had brokered. On the single question Washington cares most about in that region, Spain and Morocco sit at opposite ends. One recognized Palestine, the other recognized Israel. They are neighbors. One of them controls the other's only land border, which raises a version of this story that circulates inside Spain itself. Days after Tarajal, a party leader inside Spain's own governing coalition accused Washington and Israel of encouraging what had happened. He is not a marginal figure. His party sits in the government. The claim is not absurd. The motive exists, and I have just spent 2 minutes describing it. But a motive is not evidence, and none has been produced. That standard applies to Madrid and Rabat as much as to Washington. Or it is not a standard. What remains is not a plot. It is a position. Spain had spent 2 years making itself the least convenient government in the room. That is not a crime. It is a fact about who was standing where when the border broke. Start with the obvious one. Pull the troops out. On the 30th of April, asked directly whether he would withdraw forces from Spain and Italy, the president said he probably would. His description of Spain was not diplomatic. He called the country horrible. Then look at what is actually tied up in Rota: 5 American destroyers. Those ships are wired into NATO's missile defense architecture. They are not symbolic, and they are not quick to move. There are roughly 3,000 American service members in Spain. In Italy, around 12,500. In Germany, more than 36,000. The main alternative is Ceuta Bay in Greece. Taking it means giving up the gateway to the Mediterranean. So when the order finally came, it did not come for Spain. The defense secretary signed a withdrawal of 5,000 troops from Germany. For Spain, there is still no decision. Only the word probably. Second lever, trade. The president said publicly that he wanted all dealings with Spain cut off and told his treasury secretary as much. Except Spain does not set its own tariffs. Trade policy belongs to the European Union. Punishing Madrid on trade means punishing 26 other countries at the same time. Third lever, NATO itself. This fight predates Iran. At the Hague summit in June 2025, allies agreed a defense spending target of 5% of GDP. Sanchez refused it. By that October, the president was already suggesting Spain be thrown out of the alliance. And Spain contests that picture of itself with receipts. Sanchez has pointed out that NATO's own defense planning committee found Spain met its capability targets for 2026. 7th best of 32 allies. A country can be 7th out of 32 on capability and still be last on the one number the president is counting. Then on the 24th of April, Reuters reported an internal Pentagon email. It floated suspending Spain's participation in NATO. The same email raised reviewing the American position on the Falkland Islands, a way of signaling that alliance support is not unconditional. And here, the idea meets the founding treaty. NATO has no suspension mechanism. There is no expulsion clause. The only exit written into the treaty is Article 13, and it belongs to the member who wants to leave. Sanchez dismissed the whole thing by saying his government does not work on the basis of emails. 3 levers. One too expensive to use, one aimed at the wrong target, one that does not legally exist. So what is left? On the 4th of December 2025, the White House published its national security strategy. 33 pages. Every administration writes one. It is a document that tells the rest of the government what matters and why. Its section on Europe is unusually direct. It says that if present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less. It describes what Europe faces as civilizational erasure. It states that within a few decades at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European. And it says plainly that it is far from obvious whether some European countries will still have the economies and militaries to remain reliable allies. It supports this with numbers. Europe held about a quarter of global GDP in 1990. Today, around 14%. And it names the cause. Migration policies, the document says, are transforming the continent and creating strife. The stated goal is for Europe to remain European and to recover its civilizational confidence. It is also specific about where it sees hope, not in Europe's sitting governments, in what it calls Europe's patriotic parties. That was not a new idea. The vice president had made a version of the same argument in Munich to a hall of European officials who did not enjoy hearing it. So this is a doctrine, not a stray sentence, a strategy paper, a speech to allies, and later a budget report, all pointing the same way. Now put that on a timeline. It was published 3 months before the war with Iran began. It was published 8 months before the night at Tarajal. This is the part worth sitting with. Nobody in Washington needed to turn migration into a weapon. Washington had already declared, in writing, that migration was the thing destroying Europe. The footage from Ceuta did not create that frame. 6 documents, 4 months, in order. March 12th, Michael Rubin, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a former Pentagon official, publishes a column. He urges the President and the Secretary of State to recognize Ceuta and Melilla as occupied Moroccan territory. He argues that Spain is running colonies across the Strait of Gibraltar. Neither maps nor history lie, he writes. Rubin is not a fringe writer. He worked in the Pentagon office covering Iran and Iraq, and he has published on North African policy for 2 decades. That column was not reporting. It was an argument addressed by name to the President and the Secretary of State. March 16th, 4 days later, he goes further. He calls on Morocco to revive the spirit of the Green March, the same operation from 1975 that took Western Sahara. He describes unarmed citizens crossing into the enclaves, excavators at the border, the Moroccan flag going up. He also argues that NATO's Article 6 would not oblige the alliance to respond. April 1st, Congressman Diaz-Balart gives an interview to the Spanish newspaper El Español. He says the two cities are not in the geographic territory of Spain. They are, in his words, in the territory of Morocco. He is not a commentator with an opinion. He chairs the subcommittee that writes the foreign policy budget. Late April, the language appears in his subcommittee's report. Pages 86 and 87. Spanish-administered cities located in Moroccan territory. Long-standing Moroccan claims. Future status. A word about what these reports are. Committee reports are where the actual detail of American spending lives. They are not voted on line by line. Most members of Congress never read them. That is not a scandal in itself. It is how the appropriations process has worked for decades. It does mean a sentence can enter the record without a single person debating it. July 15th. The House votes 217 to 209. Republicans vote for it 215 to 1. That one. August 1st. 2 days after the border broke, Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky, the only Republican who voted no, goes public. He points his own party at that report. His argument is narrow and it is hard to answer. Members of Congress spent that weekend posting the footage from Tarajal as proof that open borders destroy countries. 2 weeks earlier, most of them had voted for a bill whose report called that collapsing border Moroccan land and sent $40 million to the country on the other side of it. Massie did not claim anybody planned the crossing. He said his colleagues had no standing to act surprised by it. A think tank, a congressman, a subcommittee, a chamber of Congress, and a Republican breaking ranks with all of them. That is the case. Now let me tell you exactly what it does not prove. Here is what the evidence supports, stated as plainly as I can put it. Between the 12th of March and the 15th of July, the status of two Spanish cities traveled from a think tank column to a line in a report attached to a bill passed by the House of Representatives. Nobody had to conspire with anybody for that to happen. Now, two reasons to be careful, and they are the two that matter. First, a committee report is not law. It does not change American policy. The official position of the United States is still that Ceuta and Melilla are administered by Spain. That has not moved a millimeter. Second, what Rubin proposed and what happened are not the same event. He described Moroccan citizens marching unarmed in daylight to make a political claim. What happened at Tarajal was a migration surge made up of people from several countries with their own reasons to move. Those are different things. Treating them as one is exactly the sloppiness that turns analysis into invention. So no. There is no evidence that anyone in Washington ordered what happened in Ceuta. Al Jazeera put it about as well as it can be put. No evidence of orchestration. A great many interesting coincidences, but take the coincidences out and something solid is left. And it is not a theory. A vulnerability in the territory of a NATO member was identified in public. It was argued for in print, twice, by a former Pentagon official. It was endorsed by a sitting congressman. It was written into a congressional document. $40 million went to the country on the other side of that border. All of it in the open. All of it dated. None of it denied. The question that opened this video was who opened the gates. The better question is why a gate that everybody could see was left. Watch what Europe did in the 2 days after the border broke. Italy imposed temporary controls on travel from Spain. France ordered extra checks along its Spanish border. Sanchez wrote to European capitals calling the reaction selfish, polarizing, and unlawful. And here is what makes all of that remarkable. The European Commission confirmed there had been no movement of people from Ceuta to mainland Europe, not because the border held. Ceuta is Spanish territory and it is inside the Schengen area. But Spain has always run identity checks on anyone traveling from the enclave to the mainland. Reaching Ceuta gets you onto European soil. It does not get you into Europe. The people who crossed on the 30th of July walked into a city they could not leave. Two European governments closed borders against a movement that was not happening. In Washington, the pictures did different work. The president told Americans to remember that image and said that would be them in 3 years if the wrong side won. The State Department blamed Spain directly for what it called deliberate efforts to enable mass illegal migration into Europe. There are congressional elections in November. Inside Spain, the argument turned inward fast. The interior minister acknowledged that Spanish intelligence had produced no warning at all before the 30th of July. No report. Nothing. Border management sits with his ministry. Intelligence sits with the defense ministry. Each has since been explaining the other's silence. And on the 3rd of August, the defense minister who had used the word blackmail in 2021 spoke again. She asked Morocco to investigate what had happened at the border and to follow it to the end. She added that Spanish sovereignty was not open to discussion and that the two cities would not be touched. Now look at what has not changed. The bill has passed the House. The Senate has not taken it up. Pages 86 and 87 read exactly as they did in April, and the $40 million is still in the text. Here is what happens next, and it is worth watching. The Senate writes its own version. The two chambers reconcile them. Language that survives that process ends up in the final report. Language that nobody defends quietly disappears. So there is a test coming, and it is a public one. Either a senator asks why an American spending document is discussing the future status of a NATO ally's cities, or nobody does, and the sentence stays. Ceuta and Melilla are still outside Article 5. Spain asked in 2022. The answer was no, and nobody has revisited it since. Sanchez has not moved on defense spending. The president has not decided about the troops. Every condition that made the 30th of July possible is still in place. None of it is secret. All of it is published. And there is one more document, older than all of these. In December 2020, the United States recognized Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. In exchange, Morocco normalized relations with Israel. Washington has already handed Rabat something enormous once. It did not ask Madrid then either. That is where this story goes next. What Morocco actually wants, and how much of it has already been promised. That video is coming. Subscribe and you will not miss it.